Have you ever wondered what would have happened if Deku and Bakugo were reborn with all their memories? Would they be able to change all the bad things that have happened to them? Or would knowing the future only make their path even more painful? Well, before we answer that, let's start with Izuku Midoriya. Being reborn with all of his memories, Deku would be confused, but he would try to keep quiet about the situation. He would do this in order to relive his childhood in the same way, spending his time admiring heroes and staying close to his mother. Of course, since he's Deku, he would slip up now and then, would eventually lock in because he can't afford to go through most of the pain he went through in his previous life again. He knows that he'll soon be the wielder of One for All, so he'd immediately start training his body. This would creep out everyone because he'd be the youngest gym bro in history. The same thing would happen to Bakugo, and he'd decide to work on himself as much as he can, so that he can perform even more amazing feats in this timeline. However, he'll be very different from the Bakugo we knew in Season 1. By the end of the series, Bakugo had gone through a lot of character development, so even though he'd still have some anger issues, he'd be a much more mature and reasonable guy. Also, he and Deku have already resolved their issues and become proper rival buddies, so he wouldn't be hostile towards Deku, meaning that their relationship this time around would be far less toxic and complicated. He'd suddenly stop bullying Izuku one day and dissociate himself from all the weirdos that used to join him. When Izuku announces in middle school that he wants to become a hero, Bakugo wouldn't torment him because he already knows his boy is destined for greatness. In fact, when other classmates try to bully him, he'd scare them away using his explosion powers. Deku is smart, so he'd figure out that Bakugo has been reborn just like himself. To test him, he'd call him by his awkwardly long hero name, Great Explosion Murder God Dynamite, and when Katsuki responds, he'd reveal to him that he's been reborn as well. Now that they're on the same page, they'd agree to let the initial events of their lives play out as it did, so that Deku can get One for All from All Might and get into UA. However, they'd also decide to do the most they can in order to prevent the tragedies that happened before. They'd start training their bodies together to be able to use their quirks better, doing 100 sit-ups, push-ups, and all the other stuff Saitama did. When the sludge villain attacks Deku, he'd be much more composed because he knows his goat is coming to save him. However, he'd fake a cry for help in order to alert All Might, and All Might would take out the sludge monster with a Texas smash, just like the main story. He'd geek out on him just like before and ask him if a quirkless kid like himself can become a hero, but with more certainty than last time. On the other hand, Bakugo would let himself get captured by the sludge villain, and they'd roleplay that entire dramatic moment to inspire All Might to save Bakugo and pass on One for All to Izuku. However, this time around, Deku has already become a mini Dwayne Johnson thanks to the training he's been doing, so he'd be able to complete All Might's beach cleanup training in 4 months rather than 10. After fully inheriting the legendary quirk, Izuku would set his sights on the UA entrance exam. This time, he'd be able to activate the quirk right at the start of the exam, thanks to his years of experience in his previous life, and carefully control its power output so that he wouldn't destroy his body. During the exam, he'd immediately be able to activate his full cowling technique, which would allow him to maneuver his way around the testing ground and gain combat points by destroying robots using controlled smashes. When the enormous robot shows up and endangers Ochako's life, he'd leap into action just like before, but this time he'd use his current maximum of 50% to annihilate the robot without wrecking his body in the process. This successful aura farm would allow him to pass the exams easily, and he'd also become one of the highest scorers because he not only bagged rescue points but also combat points this time. He'd immediately become one of the top prospects among the newly admitted students, and so would Bakugo, who breezed through his exam as well. When they arrive in Class 1A, they pretend like they're meeting their dear friends for the first time in order not to rouse any suspicion, even though they literally assembled like the Avengers in the previous timeline to stop All for One. During their first class test, things would be less dramatic because Bakugo already knows about Deku's powers. Bakugo would get a high score in the ball throwing contest using his explosion powers just like before. However, Deku wouldn't match Bakugo's score this time. He'd see no need to injure his body just to prove a point, so he'd throw the ball using a controlled percentage of One for All to get a reasonable score. Using similar tactics, he'd perform well in all other parts of the physical test and end up ranking 4th instead of dead last like before. When it's time for combat training, the students will be split up into heroes and villains just like the main story, and Team Deku and Ochako would be put up against Bakugo and Tenya. This would lead to the first duel between Deku and Bakugo, but unlike before, it wouldn't be a passionate and heated affair. It would rather be a fun sparring match between the besties to see who can outmaneuver each other. Bakugo would come prepared for Deku's previous strategy, but since our boy Genius has a better handle on his powers, he'd still outclass Bakugo and get the W for his team without sacrificing his body. This time, Bakugo wouldn't cry like a toddler, but rather congratulate Deku with a smile and promise to nuke him in their next fight. Fast forward to the USJ attack. Izuku and Katsuki know that the League of Villains will be coming to attack them, so they'll try to convince Mr. Aizawa to boost security in the facility. However, they'd have no real evidence to back this up, so Eraserhead will insist that he and 13 are enough to supervise them. When the villains arrive, they'd work the students to different parts of the facility like last time. Izuku would end up in the flood zone with Asui and Mineta, while Bakugo would be thrown into that fire zone along with Hiroshima. Using his improved powers, Deku would clear the flood zone easily, and round up the villains with a little help from Froppy and Mineta. After Bakugo does the same, they'd reunite at the main hall where Shigaraki and his villains are attacking Eraserhead and 13. They'd save the two heroes, preventing them from being as battered up as they were in the previous timeline. And Deku would face off against Nomu. Since he can't fully use One for All at 100%, he can't beat the monster. So he uses his 50% maximum to deal to land smashes on it, and hold it off. Eventually, All Might arrives and has a heated battle with the Nomu before sending it flying through the roof. The pros would eventually arrive and scare the other villains away. The next big event Deku and Bakugo will have to overcome is the Sports Festival. During the obstacle race, Deku will have a much easier time maneuvering through the obstacles thanks to full cowling, and he'd launch himself above the other candidates using the exploding landmine strategy he used previously. However, this time Bakugo would be on to him, and he'd catch up using a similar move, turning it into a one-on-one race for the finishing spot. Since Deku is much faster than Bakugo in his full cowling state, he'd end up winning the race and earning 1,000,000 points. The cavalry battle will be just as heated as before, but similar to last time, Todoroki's team will steal the victory. That brings us to the 1v1 battles. Unlike last time, Deku wouldn't let himself get caught by Shinso's brainwashing ability since he already knows the secret, so his first match would end up being a one-sided flex. Bakugo would have a passionate battle with Ochako, who would show the heart of a hero before eventually eating the dirt. However, the most important battle of this tournament is Deku versus Todoroki, and things will play out very differently than last time. Since Deku now has full cowling and total control of One for All, he'd be able to fend off Shoto's ice attacks easily, without repeatedly breaking his bones in front of everyone. After giving Shoto a heroic speech which motivates him to use his fire, they'd have their final clash. But this time, Deku would evade the explosion using his speed and knock Todoroki out of bounds. With this win, he'd face Bakugo in the finals of the tournament, and they'd tear the house down with their awesome moves. But ultimately, this time around, Bakugo would end up winning the tournament again. As the runner-up of the sports festival, Deku would get a ton of offers from all the top hero agencies in the country for his hero internship. However, Izuku knows he has to be in Hosu so he can help Tenya and stop Stain. So he chooses to go to Gran Torino, just like he did before. Since he already knows how to evenly distribute One for All throughout his body, Deku and Gran Torino would skip the whole fish in the microwave nonsense and begin their duel, which Deku would win by hitting him with a smash. When they arrive at Hosu, Deku would immediately run to the alley where Stain and Tenya are having their face-off, and he'd arrive before Stain can attack his friend. After giving Tenya a pep talk, he'd inform him about Stain's blood curdle ability, and the two of them would end up defeating Stain with less injuries, and they wouldn't even need Shoto's help this time. For their final exams, Deku and Bakugo would be paired up against All Might. Unlike last time, they wouldn't argue amongst themselves, but rather they'd work together and come up with a strategy because they don't want to get ragdolled like they previously were. Since All Might is the honored one, he'd figure out their plan and begin overpowering them, but they'd find a way to escape him and pass the exam. During their summer training camp with the Wild Pussycats, the League of Villains will attack, just like in the main story. However, Bakugo knows that he's the one they're after, so he'd hide out in the safe spot to prevent that from happening. Meanwhile, Deku goes up against Muscular in a bid to save Kota, but this time there will be no screaming or crying in pain on Deku's part, because he's already mastered One for All. He'd take down Muscular easily by hitting a smash in the cracks between his muscles, and join the others to scare off the remaining invaders. Since the League of Villains failed in their plans, All for One would get furious and decide to crash out by attacking the Kamino ward. Seeing this, All Might heads out to face him in battle, but he stops Deku from joining him because he knows he's not ready to face All for One yet, and wants to protect his successor just like his master Nana did for him. After a heated battle between All Might and All for One, the symbol of peace takes down the Demon Lord using his final embers of One for All, and he officially passes the torch to Deku. After coming up with their ultimate moves, the Class 1A students head out for their provisional licensing exams, where they face off against other schools. Since Deku never had to destroy his arms, he doesn't rely solely on shoot style, and this makes it easy for him to pass. Bakugo passes as well, and so does every other Class A student. Since Bakugo wasn't the cause of All Might's retirements, he doesn't get weighed down by guilt, and this means that he never has that unsanctioned fight against Deku which led to them being punished. When the class faces off against Mirio, Bakugo joins them this time, but he ends up getting knocked down like the others. Deku is already aware of Mirio's ability, and he's much stronger than last time, so it's a tough battle. But Mirio ultimately wins due to his sneaky tactics. When Deku goes for his hero work study at Night Eye's place, they'd eventually find out that Eri's being held captive by Chisaki and his criminals, and launch a rescue operation to save her. This time, Deku would arrive just in time to stop Overhaul from stealing Mirio's powers, and he'd also prevent Night Eye from being fatally stabbed. Afterwards, he'd boost up his powers to 100% using Eri's Rewind, and beat the living daylights out of Chisaki. This means that by the end of this arc, Night Eye is still alive, and Mirio still has his powers. Soon, Class 1A is split into teams and put into exhibition matches against Class 1B. Just like last time, Bakugo solos the opposing team with ease. When Black Whip awakens during Deku's match, it doesn't cause a fuss this time because he's already mastered the power. He simply uses it to take down Shinso's team and win his match. In the original timeline, the Paranormal Liberation War was brutal because an upgraded Shigaraki destroyed Jakku City, leading to the deaths of several heroes and civilians. This time around, Deku would prevent this by using his float ability and Black Whip to stop Tamura from ever touching the ground. While in the sky, Deku would pummel him as hard as he can using One for All, and Bakugo helps out as well while Aizawa prevents him from using Decay on them. Eventually, All for One helps Shigaraki escape, but things aren't depressing this time because Gran Torino wasn't impaled like last time, Aizawa didn't lose his leg, and no one died. Since everything went well during the war arc, the Hero Society would still be intact. All for One would still send villains to hunt down Deku, but this time, Deku doesn't turn into a solo vigilante because he knows how badly it affected him in his past life. This time, he enlists the help of his classmates in taking down the mercenaries, and eventually, Lady Nagant appears. Deku is the only one with the danger sensibility and the speed to dodge her bullets, so he'll tell his classmates to let him handle her solo. Using his faux 100%, he'd defeat Lady Nagant like last time and motivate her to stray from All for One. When the final war begins, the heroes would teleport to different regions where they can face the villains. But this time, Deku wouldn't let himself get dragged away to Akuto Island by Toga. This means that right from the start of the war, Deku would be at the UA Flying Fortress with Bakugo and the others to face Shigaraki. While Aizawa and Monoma negate Tamura's decay, Deku goes into gear shift mode and begins assaulting Shigaraki along with an awakened Bakugo. Since Bakugo knows how badly things turned out for him the last time, he'd be careful when attacking Shigaraki, thereby preventing his arm from being shattered again or his heart from being pierced. This means that poor Edgeshot wouldn't have to sacrifice his body to save him. This also means that Mirko and the other heroes wouldn't be injured by Shigaraki, and they'd be able to join the attack as well. Together, Deku and the others will overwhelm Tamura with attacks, leaving him no room to use his decay. When All for One starts reverting to his prime, Bakugo remembers that he's capable of defeating him, so he'd head off early to face him along with the other heroes. He prevents All for One from stealing Hawks' quirk and destroying Endeavor's arm. All Might would join the fight in his armored Heracles suit, but this time he wouldn't be endangered because he has help from Bakugo, Endeavor, and other heroes. Together, they'd pile on attacks on All for One until he's eventually reduced to dust. Meanwhile, Deku still wants to save Shigaraki, so he'd clear up his heart by transferring One for All to him. When All for One awakens in Shigaraki's body, Deku's arms wouldn't be shattered this time, because Eraserhead's quirk is still actively blocking the decay. Eventually, the heroes would begin their final attack on All for One, and Deku would finally defeat him using the Embers of One for All. Also, click on this video to see how I explain all Class 1A ultimate moves. Click it!